Good morning, everyone. My name is Jessica Sen, and we are here to talk to you a little bit about behavior management strategies. And so I see quite a few people still coming in. There are like single seats kind of up towards the front if someone wants to try to squeeze in. It also looks like maybe Nicole's bringing us some extra chairs, so thank you. Appreciate it. All right, so while everyone's getting settled, we're gonna go ahead and kind of get started. I'm gonna introduce myself. Like I said, my name is Jessica. I'm an LPCC-S, which means I'm a therapist. However, I also am formerly a teacher, a special ed teacher. So I have a background in education, kind of like morphed into like therapy, and now I am the director of Grow Well Cleveland and see clients day to day, but work with a variety of clients, specifically children with special needs. They come see me quite often, things like that. So I'm gonna let Holly speak next.
Hi everyone, my name is Holly Chalkwater. So I also work alongside Jessica at Grow Well Cleveland. I am a therapist as well, same credentials. So a little bit of my background. Prior to this position, I worked in community mental health. So I was working in the schools and in the office, working primarily with children, adolescents, and families. So part of what we'll talk about today in regards to behavior management are some different approaches. One of them being parent management training, which is the primary one that I have been trained in and applied with families throughout my work.
All right, so we were provided some information from the foundation when they reached out to us asking us to present. And so these are facts that most of you, if not all of you, have probably seen at some point, in that 72% of children with temporal lobe surgery have some type of psychiatric diagnosis after surgery, and 46% with no prior diagnosis tend to develop a new psychiatric disorder after surgery. As far as hysterectomy goes, about 46% have mild to severe, which is obviously a broad range of behavioral problems after surgery. The most common types of mental health issues associated with epilepsy are depression, ADHD, with or without hyperactivity, but we just call it ADHD, anxiety disorders, aggression. So we wanted to try to tailor our presentation to you all as best as we could. So we would like to hear from you guys in regard to both age of kiddos that you're working with or that you have. We would also like to know who all is like a professional or a parent. So we'll start with the latter. Raise your hand if you're a parent. Well, that solves that problem. Raise your hand if you have like a kiddo that would be considered not a teenager, so younger than teen. Okay, so, and then who has a teenager? A few, okay, all right, cool. So hopefully our presentation then is going to fit with some of the things that you guys are already experiencing on a daily basis with your children. One of the things that we wanted to also ask you about is we have, a list of things that are kind of common disorders. If there's something on this list that you feel is more prevalent or you'd like some information about, like, raise your hand, let us know. So if there's something other than things like aggression or ADHD or, depression or anxiety, like, let us know so we can try to work with that or adapt that and incorporate like other strategies and things into what we're going to be talking about today. Anyone have anything they want to throw out right now, or you wait a little bit longer? Rage. Okay, so not aggression, rage. All right.
Maybe like repetition.
Repetition?
Yeah.
Okay, repeating behaviors. Okay.
And
Impulsivity. Okay. Panic attacks. Okay. Self-harm. Okay.
Emotional regulation.
Okay, so emotional regulation, so no like emotional outbursts, things like that?
Yes.
Okay.
Obsessive, like obsessing over something.
Okay, would that fit with repetition?
Maybe.
A little bit?
Repetition, I think, will come over for separation.
Yes.
Taking the same step and all.
Ruination? Correct. Okay. Anything else? No? Okay. Cool. All right, Holly.
All right, so first, just to give a little bit of an idea of what some typical behavior management methods or modalities are that we see treatment-wise. So a lot of these are used both in schools and at home. And I'll kind of highlight some differences between them and also talk about some of the commonalities. So parent management training is one that I mentioned being trained in, and this primarily deals with working individually with the parent in a therapeutic setting. So a lot of it is education, coaching about different steps, about different skills and approaches to use with the child within the home. Positive parenting program is pretty similar in that regard, where that does involve a lot of work primarily with the parent and then also with the parent and child. Parent-child interaction therapy is more of working with the parent and child together in a therapeutic setting and looking more so at the dynamic, how they're interacting with one another, and trying to build some of those skills to create a healthier, high-quality dynamic. And then the next couple, the multisystemic and the brief strategic family therapy, these are more primarily used in adolescents that have more severe behaviors, so more severe aggression, even juvenile delinquency, those type of situations, alcohol and substance abuse as well. And then the last, the PBIS, is used primarily in schools, but we are going to pull some strategies from that to talk about today, just because they can be used within the home as well. And the main commonality between most of these, which you'll notice as we're going throughout today, is looking a lot at positive reinforcement. So we want to be reinforcing positive behavior. And then we also want to be ignoring negative behavior at times, which we will talk about that in depth because we know that we can't always ignore behaviors, especially if they're aggressive behaviors. But those are some of the commonalities that most of these approaches encompass.
Okay, so as she stated, there's the common behavior intervention strategies. They usually consist of positive opposites, appropriate prompting, positive reinforcement, age-appropriate consequences, timeouts, attending and ignoring behaviors, behavior shaping, and modeling desired behavior. Side note, we did upload our presentation to the schedule.com website, so for everyone that is taking notes and or photos or whatever, please continue to do so. That doesn't bother me, but I also wanted to let you guys know that if you want to download this, because there's a ton of links and things towards the end, it is all accessible and online, so you can get that information there. Don't have to write down URLs correctly. So as far as how this all plays out, having been a special ed teacher and worked primarily with kiddos on the autism spectrum, it is my understanding that post-surgery, a lot of kiddos that have this type of surgery end up exhibiting autism-like behaviors. So that would be the repetition, that would be the self-harming, that would be the rumination, the rage when they don't understand or can't communicate appropriately, things like that. So these are really designed to help correct some of those things, but they're also designed to help catch a child being good. And I'm sure that this is something that the majority of you have probably already heard before. And being a parent myself, I am well aware of how difficult that particular task is. So we will do our best to try to give you some actual skills to do and things to do at home, not just ignore when they're banging on the wall, because we all know that if your kid bangs on the wall for about 8 hours a day, you're probably going to lose it at some point. So ignoring in that particular example, not going to be super productive. So we're going to try our best to give you guys some actual tools, tips, tricks, things like that can help maybe stop the behavior before the behavior escalates to the point of no return.
So first component that we're going to talk a little bit about is basically language that we're using with the children. So when you're giving them some type of prompt or something that you want them to do, looking at the language and the semantics that you're using when you're giving them that direction. So naturally, what we typically do, especially if a child is exhibiting some type of either aggressive or problem behavior, is we like to tell them to stop doing that. So, like stop hitting, don't yell, things like that. So that's our kind of natural tendency, just in the way that our brains are wired and the way that we're conditioned. So what we're going to talk about today is actually the importance of how we're delivering those messages or those prompts to kids and how they respond differently to those. So this just gives some examples of specific problem behaviors and the positive opposite that you could use. Basically because we want to be saying the behavior that we want the child to exhibit, not saying the negative behavior. So for example, with tantrums, you would be asking them or praising them if they're handling the disappointment calmly, for example. Or if they're yelling, please use your indoor voice, things like that. With aggression, a big one is trying to practice using a calm body. So again, a lot of the times we might want to say, like, don't hit or, don't hurt yourself, things like that. But you can use a lot of language in regards to, use a calm body, show me a calm body, talking to the child about what that looks like so that you're really reinforcing that behavior when they show it. And then this is just another example to that that I think touches on a lot of different common statements that we like to use and gives you an alternative. So again, trying to avoid saying, no, don't, stop. And then there's some replacement examples for that. So this is a way of also redirecting the child. So for example, if they're doing something that is not an ideal behavior or not a behavior that you want to see, you can also provide a suggestion or a redirection, such as, let's find a better activity, or, please use this instead. So say, even if they're using, language, for example, that's not appropriate within the household, please use this instead, because then you're actually giving them a suggestion that they can take and use, which helps them to process that within their brain. Because a lot of the times if we're just saying don't do that or stop doing that, and we're not giving them a positive prompt or an example of what they could do instead, then they're having to think even harder about what they should be doing in that moment. So a lot of the times as you're using this in a repetitive way and being consistent with that with kids, they start to pick up on that. So you won't have to be prompting them quite as much. They'll start to pick up on what you actually want them to do in that moment. But this is a good way to start that. It's an interesting experience for a lot of parents, just because, like I said, that's not our natural tendency. So a lot of the time starting out this process, I'll ask parents to just monitor themselves and notice, how many times are they saying no or don't or stop, and just trying to be more aware of that, because it's such a lot of times such an unconscious process that we don't even realize we're doing that.
So we have a little video here. I don't know if it's going to play. Doesn't look like it's got a link going on, so that's okay. Basically all this is kind of a little video in which we were just trying to show the positive reinforcers that Holly was just talking about, but Holly did a really good job of explaining some of the things that we were already trying to get at. So I'm not going to worry too much about this. It was like 30 seconds. The thing is that I want to point out about this video, especially this particular image right here. These two girls are sitting on the couch playing like Uno together, and he just walks up and says, I like that you're playing so nicely together. So one of the things that we tend to do is that we tend to only engage with behavior correcting tactics once the behavior has already escalated or become something we don't want to see. So it's very, very important to try to catch, again, to use that phrase, catch your kid being good, meaning like if nothing's going on, that doesn't mean that you can't reinforce your child with the appropriate behavior or the appropriate, thank you for playing nicely together, things like that. It's very, very difficult to break that habit, as Holly was stating, but it's something that you consciously have to be aware of yourself. And I know that, again, being a parent, there's so many other things that we have to be aware of that this doesn't always seem like top of mind. But if we can work to change the way we phrase things with other adults, with our partners, significant others, whatever, coworkers, it does help to reinforce it in our brain, so it does end up becoming more natural over time, so that you can just inevitably say like, oh, hey, that's awesome. Like, thanks for cleaning up the dishes, even though you didn't have to ask them to clean up the dishes, but it was something that you noticed they did, and so that you could reinforce that. Questions, concerns? Yes.
Well, I just wanted to bring up on the verbalizing good, if you could go back up on slide.
Sure.
I think.
Absolutely.
Because I know like my daughter, and she's 12 now, but she still doesn't process a lot of words.
Correct.
So, like, we did this because this is good instead of, always the negative, but we'd have to do like nice touch.
Yes, correct.
So we
Abbreviated.
shortened to like 2 words.
Yep.
To get it to stick. So, I mean, I don't know how many parents are new to this, but for us, that was something we had to learn, is she's not processing a lot
Correct.
of words. And the more you speak, the more she didn't understand.
Correct. Yes, that is one thing that you're like absolutely true. In that environment, you do end up having to kind of clip what we're saying. We have a tendency to want to explain why we're asking someone to do something. And in this case, or in a lot of these cases, that explanation is lost. They hear the don't, they hear the stop, they hear the no, and then your audience is gone. So you have to really be forceful with that. And yes, like nice touch, like calm body, things like that are oftentimes more readily accepted. Think of it as someone that may potentially be in shock, like prior to an accident or something like that. What do we typically do? You repeat the same thing over and over, and you do it in a soothing voice, and you do it like just calmly, and you do shorter versions of whatever you're trying to say, right? This is kind of the same concept. It's abbreviated so that tiny window that you have where your kid's actually listening to you at that moment, like you actually get your message across and you get it across effectively so that they're understanding it and like taking it in. And so the alternative, as Holly mentioned previously, is that when you do things like calm body, you're giving them the alternative that you want them to do. So you're simultaneously kind of correcting the negative behavior, but also giving them the preferred behavior such that we would hope they would be able to engage in that preferred behavior.
So what if they don't want it? Like you're trying to, like my son oftentimes has like our time being redirected. So like I try really hard to avoid saying no, don't stop, quit, and try to redirect. But I mean, I can say it 10 times and he still wants to do that behavior that I don't want him to do, which is oftentimes a really loud voice. So you get to a point where then automatically you're like, just stop.
Yeah. No, I've been there.
Yeah. Do you guys have advice or tactics in terms of like if it's the type of thing where you're trying to redirect and they just don't want to be redirected?
We do. We're getting there. Those would be consequences. We haven't got there quite yet. Alternatively, we also are doing a second presentation this afternoon about coping skills for parents. So, if it was my choice, yes. I feel that all therapy goes by. Yeah, go ahead.
My son is younger than most.
Yeah.
He's only 4.
Okay.
So when he is throwing or hitting or fighting, we do try. We tell him the behavior that we want, but it almost always starts out with, no, do this. Do you have any suggestion if you don't want us to say no, because he's only 4, so we really like.
Well, for example, a really good one for biting, believe it or not, is to say ow really loudly and say,
He bites himself.
oh, okay. That probably, all right, so let me think about that one a second then, because that's different than what I was thinking. Yes, chew toys. That's what I was getting ready to say. Alternative behavior. So, for example, if your child is a hitter, have them punch pillow, punch something else, punch like an acceptable alternative. It's not so much that we want them to stop trying to get that emotion out of their body. We just need to direct the emotion to something that's safe. Does that make sense? Okay. So like things like chew toys are really good if he's a biter of himself. If he likes to chew on things that are inappropriate also, so they make, chew toys for those types of things as well. So yeah, we're just trying to give an alternative so that they can get the emotion out of their body, but in a safe manner. This one, the next one, okay.
So this is kind of building on the conversation we were just having about prompting the child. So talking about being specific. So in regards to if you do have to use only a couple of words, you're still being very specific about what you're wanting that child to do. So the first one, backstepping for a moment and being calm, is not that that's always easy, especially in moments of heightened emotion or frustration or impatience, but looking at the tone and the volume that you're using and the way that you're giving the prompt, right? So if it is, even if you're saying something that is a positive behavior, but it's in a loud or aggressive tone, a lot of the times they might respond to that in the same way that they would to a negative prompt. So just a lot of times pausing even for a second and taking a step back and saying what you need to say and just being very mindful of where you're at and how you're feeling in the moment when you're communicating with the child. And in regards to being specific, evidence also shows that you want to be very specific about what the behavior is. Now, this does depend on the situation, of course. So let's say if you're giving the child a prompt of picking up after themselves. So you're going to want to be very specific about, can you please pick up your shoes and put them in the bin? Or, exactly what you're wanting them to do in the moment, and giving one direction at a time, because a lot of the times we might say, you need to go clean up your room and make your bed and put your clothes away, but then they're lost at that point, or they have, they grasped the first thing you said and nothing after that. So being very specific about what you're wanting from them. And using statement form is very important as well. So when you're saying, can you do this, for example, sometimes kids will perceive that as it's a choice because you're asking them a question, rather than if you're saying, please pick this up. So that's something to just be mindful of and try to catch yourself at times if you notice doing that too, because that does tend to be another natural way that we give prompts. And it's okay. When we're saying use statement form, it's not that it has to be very strict and firm. It's just that you don't want to be asking in a question form to give them the idea that they have the choice as to whether they want to do that or not. So we know there's appropriate time for choices and there's not appropriate time for choices. So in giving prompts, we want that to be in statement form. And then it just talks a little bit about here how sometimes we do need to take a step back and really think about where we're at and pay attention to ourselves before re-engaging with the child.
In terms of be calm, this also rules out whisper yelling. So I don't know how many of us have whisper yelled at our child in a public place, but let me tell you, they know that you're angry at them, and that defeats the point. So the idea is that you remain as calm as possible so that you're not giving them any additional fuel for the fire, right? Because once we start reacting, they will react to us, and now we're in a power struggle. It's not a good look. So this next thing is, it goes, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just to understand, if you're too calm, are you de-emphasizing the fact that you want their behavior to change? If you have a little bit more of an urgency to your statement, would you not then send a statement to them, yeah, this is not good behavior, I should change it, as opposed to being calm? It's just basically could be perceived as just a request.
Okay, in some regards, yes, I can understand how that would go. What I will say to that is, it really depends on your child, to be honest with you, but the vast majority of kiddos that I've worked with, they have, honestly, they know that something's going on. They know they don't feel right. They know that they're mad or angry or sad or something like that, but they can't necessarily get it out. And so when we're placing more urgency on whatever's going on, they become, in my experience, doubly frustrated. Okay, so when you've got a kiddo that knows that they need to like keep their hands to themselves at the store, but all they want to do is like touch something, and you've, say like, don't touch it, and you've been calm, but you're escalating, then like they then tend to turn that on themselves, and then we have self-esteem issues in regard to like they think they can't do anything right. So as much as urgency is important, especially in a safety issue, the idea of keeping calm isn't so much like making them think it doesn't matter so much as it is helping them to understand that they have an alternative and that we still love them, we still care for them, all of those things, and that they can try again. Does that kind of like answer?
Well, then what's the next step? Okay, you've done the calm approach, but yet it may not have sunk in that it matters, that their behavior does have consequences.
Well, those would be the consequences then, yeah. That's where we're working up toward in terms of like, then what do you do in terms of like consequences, like interactions with your kiddo when they have chosen not to follow a direction or a prompt and like they've decided to go AWOL, right? So, go ahead.
Well, like my son's missing part of his amygdala, so
Yeah.
he can't, physiologically is unable, so how does that work into all this?
Physiologically unable to,
Because a lot of things are a threat to him.
yes.
And so physiologically, it may not.
So meaning like he goes more to like,
fight or flight.
yeah, lizard brain immediately kicks in is what you're
Yeah.
saying?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
So that would be more or less like what we were talking about a little bit before in terms of like just constant repetition. As much as they repeat, you have to equally repeat as much until it kind of sinks in. And then there's also like the safety issue in terms of like, yes, we have to ensure our child's safety. Sometimes that requires abandoning a full grocery cart full of stuff and leaving if that's what it takes, if that's what, to the level that we're at. Things like that. Those are very good questions, but they're also very specific questions. And so a lot of times answering those requires, more work, more time together, things like that. So, which I'm happy to try to work out. Go ahead.
I know you said that you work with a lot of autistic children.
Yes.
Do you think there's a lot of correlation in the way that the brain functions as an autistic child, while we do see the same behaviors, but in the outcomes? When we're talking about children who've had such a drastic brain surgery.
Do I think that there's similarity between the outcome of someone that may be diagnosed with autism versus brain surgery?
Right. To kind of, I think most of us can say that our kids organically, physiologically cannot always grasp the consequences we learn.
I do agree. I do think that there is similarity because in my experience, kiddos with autism tend to have a lack of insight. And the lack of insight is the thing that creates a situation where they don't understand what they're doing is inappropriate or like that it's urgent or one of those things, right? So sometimes, yes, there's, in my opinion, an overlap. Okay, so the next part of this is where we're starting to kind of go into what we would consider more options for you guys to use. One of the things that I've always used with people is house rules, okay? This is something where you and your family members, all of them, would, living in the home, would discuss and decide 3 to 5 non-negotiable house rules. House rules should include major violations of safety, space, security, mainly, right? So these would include like hitting, punching, biting, things like that, right? Like, and that could be toward another or toward themselves. That could be like a violation of like a house rule, okay? So, for example, we would have, a list of like 3 to 5 house rules. Those are the non-negotiables. When I say non-negotiable, that means that there is a consequence, a specific agreed upon consequence that everyone agrees on, that if that house rule is violated, this is the thing that happens, okay? Then everything else, though, is negotiable. So this is oftentimes where I start losing parents sometimes because they're like, what, you want me to negotiate with my kid? I do to some extent, because oftentimes what is happening is that your kiddo on some level, maybe not like a conscious level, but oftentimes it's a power struggle. And so they want to do the thing they want to do. They may not know why they want to do the thing they want to do. They just want to do it. And when you tell them no, they see you as the obstacle. And so then we have a power struggle with each of us trying to one up the other to achieve the end goal, which is basically the kid getting to do whatever they want to do. Okay? So yes, there should be some negotiation in terms of like, you know, if, like I'm thinking like teenagers are easier to negotiate with, in my opinion, sometimes. So like, if you want to go out tonight, then I need you to take your sister to soccer practice for me. Things like that, right? Like, it's negotiable. It might be a weekday or something, which inherently would be like, oh no, you can't go out on a school night. But you know what? Like, if it's going to become a power struggle, perhaps we could find or negotiate, work something out, right? This is aside, obviously, from the house rules. Can't remember. Okay. So the next, yeah, go ahead.
Can you give a couple examples of house rules? I mean, one I think of for my child and maybe other children is, you know, not eloping.
Yes.
You cannot run out of the house. Like, that's a non-negotiable.
Right.
Any other ones that you could give examples of that you see in your practice or when people have used?
So I would say real quick for that
Okay,
one
we're talking
too,
about-
you would want to, so the opposite of that would be staying in the house unless you have permission otherwise, for example, right? So framing it,
Saying it in the positive.
right, when you're developing the rules, it's what you like want them exactly to be doing. But, so for example, other house rules might be keeping hands to self, you know, calm body, or I mean, typically kids respond equally to like calm body, hands to self, because you don't want to be saying, you know, the house rule is there's no hitting your brother or sister or whatever it might be. Other examples from you?
Just basically, like, it really depends on the household, to be honest with you. I typically make non-negotiable the house rules as things that would violate someone's safety, security, and what was the other one? Space. So safety, security, and space are generally like the things that I tend to base like house rules on. Okay, so this next thing is, oh, sorry, did you have a question?
Typically what we say in the house is like no means no, like if somebody says stop, like for your personal space. So is that a positive way to say that though? I mean, it doesn't sound very positive.
So there's actually a term that we're going to get into also that they use in parent management training a lot, and it's called minding. So basically, minding is doing what you're asked without arguing. So depending on the situation, that might be something that would be appropriate. But you could also go with, I would say, you know, doing what you're asked, or
someone's decision.
listening, respect someone's decision. There's definitely some different ways that you could twist that, or like, you know, respecting boundaries depending on how old the child is, if they have that concept of boundaries.
Wrestling and stuff, and then it gets too much, and then somebody says stop, and the other person doesn't, and that's typically it. So it's,
Respect the request.
But it can go
Yeah.
on to other things in life, obviously.
Right.
Right, clearly. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is ways to motivate kiddos. Okay, so this is from PBIS. PBIS stands for the Positive Behavior Intervention System. It tends to be a school-based thing, but let me tell you, it can be used across the board. It's amazing. The website we'll show you later, it has tons of things on it. You go to the website and the first thing you see is like nothing but like the behaviors. You click on them, and then under each one are like 3 different tiers of interventions to do. And yes, it says like, oh, does the student, blah, blah, blah. That doesn't matter, because the interventions are useful at home and at school, because the behaviors are the same at home and at school oftentimes. So the thing that I'm highlighting from here is the forced choice reinforcement survey. So this is a survey that can easily be given. It's 40 questions. It's basically, would you rather? So it's phrased as like, would you rather have an A on your paper or have a candy bar, your favorite snack? Would you rather have your friends ask you to sit with them at lunch, or have your teacher tell you great job? And so you ask these questions, you rate it, and it comes up with one of the 5 motivating factors. And those are consumable, independent, adult approval, peer approval, and competitive. okay? So consumable is basically as easy as it sounds. We'll work for food, or we'll work for a reward. Like, I want an Xbox. Like, all right, I'll clean. It's cool. Independent is probably the most difficult one, because independent is basically, I want to do what I want to do when I want to do it. And if you were trying to get your kiddo to do something in the meantime and they're dead set on playing their new Xbox, then that's going to be a problem. So trying to motivate a kiddo that's independent means giving them free time, giving them freedom, giving them choice, things like that. Adult approval is the easiest one, because this is essentially, good job, great job, that's amazing, I'm so proud of you. Peer approval is second hardest, I would say, because this is where the kiddo just wants people to like them. They want their friends to hang out with them, ask them to be part of their team or be on their group or whatever. And then competitive is essentially where they want to be kind of like the best, right? So they want their paper to be on the bulletin board. They want you to use their math test as an example, or they want at home to say, you know, you did a great job cleaning up your shoes or something like that, and like make it known to everyone. Like, for example, you know, your partner would come home and you'd say, you know, Josie did a great job cleaning up her shoes today, right? Like, they want to be like a good example for everyone. So reinforcers serve as incentives. They must be consistent. They must be given immediately after the positive behavior. They only get positive reinforcement if using the desired behavior. So I'm going to see if this will let me open this. It might not. Yeah, I might have froze it. Great. Yay. Okay. Well, this is the actual survey, right? So I was going to click this link. Hopefully it was going to open up and give you guys the actual survey so that you could see what it looks like. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like it's doing that, so.
And is that something that we have access to?
Yes, it's on PBIS.
No,
Correct. Nope. It is printable. This is the PDF. You can print as many copies as you want. It's free. It's on PBIS. Oh, you have it. The link does work, just not on this computer. Yay!
So you can access it from home. So that's a plus.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, you guys are going to get a little entertaining thing here, so hold on. Because it crashed.
So it is, when you go on the website, like Jessica was saying, you can actually choose different behaviors, and there's handouts, there's interventions, there's tons of educational material, you know, for several different behaviors. So you can look at what behavior you're targeting specifically to.
That's
not on here.
not at all on my screen. To like a right there. That's not doing it. Here's the volume.
Oh.
Okay.
We're at 100% volume, so.
Sorry about that. It's for whatever reason deciding to be goofy. Okay, so it's not gonna go.
Yes.
The thing while we're waiting, was it schedules.com?
Yeah, so it was, yes, sched.com. I think it was just sketch.com.
Yep.
And then we just look up the epilepsy conference?
Yes, and if you go to the schedule itself, this workshop will pop up and you can click on it, and there's a link at the bottom where the presentation is uploaded to it. So you should be able to just open it in PowerPoint. Because there are
Pediatric epilepsy surgery conference, because I first did the Brave Cover conference. The pediatric epilepsy.
It won't go. Gets up, could like.
It's an ad,
It won't work.
and it's like a yellow space guy.
I don't know what's going on. It won't.
and it won't click enable.
No. It won't accept it. Like I don't. It's like frozen. I don't know how to get it to that because I don't see that on here. Well, I'm glad somebody has it. Because I don't. It won't load. Like it's, yeah, you're going to have to. But that's okay. We'll get it fixed and then we have our We have our other thing, so.
I'm in the hotel.
Do you have the thing? It won't show up, so I don't know.
Like
I don't know what's going on.
even if you hit enable, it won't hit enable.
Yeah, I can't get it to even show.
Okay, well, I'll go get the AD
Okay,
guys.
cool.
'cause they'll-
All right. Sweet.
Thank you.
So we have ours printed, so we're going to keep going until someone comes in and gets it. This is my punishment for clicking a link.
It's on the conference website.
All right.
Yeah. So as far as the positive reinforcement goes, the Forced Choice Reinforcement Survey is available. It's on pbisworld.com. So while everyone has their phones out and they're checking these things out, if you want to go to pbisworld.com, feel free. That is the website that a lot of these things can come from, and it's available to everyone. It is not just for educators. It's directed toward educators, but like everyone can use it, okay? So you could see on there, like there's tons of information. There's like all kinds of interventions once you start clicking through. There's different levels of intervention. So there's tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. Tier 1 is your basic interventions. Tier 2 is more in-depth. Tier 3 is obviously the most in-depth. Some of the things are for teachers, but the majority of them can be readily adapted to at home. So, any questions? Anything anybody like wants to like kind of like chat about while we wait for apparently them to come fix my mess? Okay, guy in the back first.
So any insight into, my daughter's 14, or turns 14 this week, and she's got a little, boyfriend that she's enamored with. And I think the approach I would take versus the younger one, where I just threaten the kid and, take him out back and work with her new little
Probably not.
who's kind of on the spectrum.
Thank you.
They, we caught them kind of kissing one day, and we kind of tried to explain to her, but I think it kind of goes over her head,
Where's
the,
my-
the behavior of what's acceptable and maybe not acceptable. Any insight into that?
So it sounds like you have had the conversation about being very specific about like boundaries, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. Oh, thank you. What feedback did you get from her on that? I know you're saying it doesn't seem like it may be registered.
She, cause we kind of started talking a little more about, appropriate touching, different things and that. And I think the excitement is so, with the hormones and that. And so I went over to their place one day and they kissed again, and she got in the car and she said, Daddy, we kissed. I was like, all right, I'm not to kill the kid. But I said, well, okay, well, we talked about it's inappropriate. And my mistake is I said, well, we'll just ignore this. Don't tell your mother, right? She comes home and says, Mommy, guess what? We made out. I'm like, I'm dead. So, I learned my lesson, not telling Mommy it was a mistake. But I said, like, you can't do that. We talked about that. Yeah, okay. And then all I hear is I'm in love, and unfortunately, like a typical 14-year-old girl, the hormones have kicked in and that, and so it's kind of hard to, we let her see them, but I'm trying to you can't sit between them the whole time either, so it's kind of an odd situation.
I would encourage you to work on finding some additional activities that she could engage in terms of like distracting her a little bit. Like I know it's not a perfect solution. I know it's not like the solution, but at the same time, like oftentimes when we get fixated on things, something more interesting might come up, like so getting her involved in like other activities if possible, something like that could help with some of like the infatuation. But then again, there's also 14-year-old infatuation. So, contact, supervision, chaperoning, things like that are all things that sound like you're already doing. Unfortunately for this one, it doesn't sound like there's like a perfect solution. This, again, is kind of like the question I had up here earlier. Take a little bit more time and thought and things like that to work out what best way to handle the situation. I know there was someone else up front, I think. Okay, go ahead.
Do you see the behaviors they outgrow as they age, as they get older?
Depends. It depends on the level of severity. It depends on a ton of things. So in general, I think based on the experience I have had, I would have to go with no. It just depends on, again, severity, things like that. You are all the experts on your children. I'm not. So if your kiddo has had X surgeries or things like that, then you know the limitations that they may have going into teenage years, adulthoods, things like that. But over time, depending on, your own kiddo, sure, yeah, there's always improvement. There's always improvement because if we change the way we communicate with our kiddo, there's improvement. We change the way, help a child learn how to communicate better on their own, there's always improvement. But it really just depends on the kid and the behavior. Is there one other?
It was me, but just go.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, I still don't have like a thing, so I just have to go forward on that like that.
Okay. Okay, so on the same note of positive reinforcement. So incentive charts, point programs definitely can be kind of controversial. Like, how many people here have tried one of those approaches?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's what we hear a lot of the times is, we tried that, it didn't work, they didn't respond to that. So what we're going to go through is a little bit more in depth about how you want to actually be using that chart, because that's what either makes it effective or ineffective. So I'll go through some of that, and then if people have questions, we'll get into that as well. But just to give you some background, so again, when you're developing the chart, and in a couple of slides, we'll have some visual examples as well to see what that can look like. So you want to be looking at what behavior you're targeting. A lot of the times it is starting with only one specific behavior. So this is the behavior on your chart, let's say minding, for example, like I mentioned. So doing what's asked of you the first time without arguing. And then obviously, depending on the child's age, would be, say, how many points you want to give them for that behavior. Like, if it's a behavior that they really, really struggle with, then you probably want to have a higher reinforcement for that. And we'll talk about that, where if you're using the chart and they start to get better and more consistent at that behavior, we want to continue reinforcing them, but it doesn't always need to be at the level it was started. Because a lot of the times what people will say too, which is at the bottom here, I don't want to have to use a chart with them forever. So what if I'm using this chart and they're responding well to that, then what do I do moving forward? So really these charts are just used as a motivator to start seeing that positive behavior and reinforcing it so that the child hopefully becomes more used to it, and then you're not having to, say, use a chart every single day, for every single year of that behavior. So with the chart, what you want to do is you want to review that together as a family, talking about how they did, providing any type of praise, and going back to what Jessica was saying about the survey and different incentives, so really tailoring to your child what you want their incentive to be. And that would be something discussed when you're starting the chart so that they know exactly what to expect. So they know if I do this behavior, 4 out of the 7 days of this week, this is the reward that I'm going to get. So there's no question about what they're expecting. And then the other thing being, if they meet that goal of whatever their incentive or their chart is, they need to be given that reward that was discussed, even if there was negative behavior that occurred along the way. So that's something that can be a little bit controversial as well, but really that's because we're looking at targeting this one specific behavior, and if they're doing well with that, we want to make sure that they're rewarded for that, and that, the reward isn't taken away from them because they engaged in a completely different behavior. You can take note of whatever that behavior was and potentially use it as your next target, but we want to have a very specific focus, essentially. So this just gives an example of some rewards. So again, these would vary depending on what motivates the child. But in general, so for children, you can even give small things such as stickers, playing a game or picking a game for the family to play. Some kids like, picking what to have for dinner or things like that. So you can use more social incentives as well. If you don't want to be just giving the child, say, a prize, for example, it can be, you get to pick something that we're all going to do together on Friday night or something along those lines as well. For adolescents, they might be more reinforced with, time with friends, staying up, say, 15 minutes later than usual, 20 extra minutes of screen time, things like that. So really depending upon the child themselves, what motivates them. And then this is just an example of a common one for younger kids because it's very simple. So you're saying what the behavior is they're working on, and you're filling in, say, a sticker or a star or whatever it might be when they engage in that behavior. And then you're having kind of a breakdown of, when we check in on this, say we're going to review it every 3 days. So when we check in, if you have 5 stars, this is what you're going to get. This is going to be your reward. And you might have that even written on there so they have a visual of what their reward is as well. And then as time goes on, you might be adding more circles once they're getting better at that behavior so that they're practicing it a lot more consistently. Yes?
What age can you start something like this generally?
So you can start pretty young just because it is more of a visual tool as well. So even if, what child are you thinking? What age?
2.5.
Okay, so
The
that's...
next slide will show you that too.
Mm-hmm. You want to get into that then?
Sure. Okay. So this next one is probably the most basic of all the kind of like boards or strategies that we have. It's called the first then board. Essentially what it is first you pick up your shoes, first you put your shoes on, then we go to the park. Things like that. So yes, this is definitely appropriate for someone, for a kiddo that would be very young. So 2 easily could do this, like first then. The thing that I want to mention about this, though, too, goes along with what Holly was talking, but all of the things that we're talking about, you have to look very closely at the time interval in which you're looking for a child to have an appropriate behavior. Based on what all of you told us at the beginning of the session, we're not looking at days on end here for appropriate behaviors in terms of let's wait all week to see if we can go to the movies on Friday. Because by Tuesday morning, that ship has sailed. So we need to condense the amount of the interval in which we're looking to reward our children for the positive behavior, right? So in this case with the first then board, literally it's a single activity in that moment. The thing that Holly had before, kind of like the little caterpillar guy, I would do that for no more than for a really young kid or a kid that has maybe some more significant behaviors. I would go no more than an hour to 2 hours at a time with that. So your behaviors and your reinforcers need to be very readily available, right? You can't buy them an Xbox every 2 hours. You have to have smaller rewards, things like that. You have to really look at what your child is capable of, what is the attention span that your kiddo has, what is the time frame that you can work easily in so that the child is successful. Because the whole goal here is that they feel successful in the end. We don't want to start something in which they have to go for 5 days, they inevitably fail because the next time we start it again, they're like, well, no, I'm not even going to try because I know I'm going to lose it by tomorrow. Questions? I think I saw yours first. Go ahead.
How do you move past the incentive charts? Because I have 2 kids that are in very different places, but my older one that's more savvy has become very dependent on the incentive charts, and he can argue and manipulate and say, well,
Yes.
if I'm not going to get such and such, I'm not going to shower. What's in it for me? He's
Correct.
dependent on it. And I can't get him to sort of move past that and understand, do it because it's the right thing to do, rather
Well,
than what you're going to get out of it.
I think I don't know which slide it was, but basically it says that they're just simply a crutch to get the appropriate behavior going again. And then once we get to that point, we want to, for example, a kiddo that is savvy, older, not necessarily a 2-year-old that just needs first then board. But someone that's older could be you need to start extending the amount of time before the reward happens. So it's very behavioralistic in that you extend the amount of time and then sometimes you don't get a reward, but then sometimes you randomly do get a reward. So the random reinforcement is the thing that keeps the behavior going if you're looking at it in purely behavioralistic terms. So you would extend it and then you would add something else to it. So basically making the child work harder in the long run because you're not going to want to reward a kiddo for taking a shower until they're 18 and move out, potentially. Yes.
So if you have a child who is driven by this, but then they don't get it, and so let's say they didn't get the reward, so now they'll tell you, not only am I not going to do the behavior that I was going to get a reward for, but now I'm also not going to do my homework, and I'm also not going to get ready for bed, and I'm going to make your life miserable for the next 3 hours because you did not give me my reward. What do you do with this child who is motivated by this, but at they don't, like, it's all downhill.
Okay, so in this case, it sounds to me like very much the interval may have been too long because we want the kiddo to always be successful on that one specific behavior. So I get that what you're saying, that they don't get the reward, so then we need to shorten the interval so that we can almost guarantee they get the reward to start, right? So that they have motivation to move forward in the long run so that it's not this thing where they immediately are like, well, screw this. I don't want to do this anymore because I'm not going to get this thing. So we have to shorten the interval for the reward to guarantee they get the reward for the first couple of times, however long it takes, to get them back started.
And so specifically from the PMT method, what they recommend, like saying to the child and using with the child, which obviously can work sometimes, but maybe not others, is simply telling them, you didn't earn your star at this time, we'll try again later. That way they at least know that they have another opportunity to try to earn it, so that's another thing that might be useful as well.
But if the not earning it in that interval is the thing that sets them off for the rest of the day, then the interval does need to be shortened and they do need to get the reward in that interval, so that we can have another time, because otherwise they're not going to want to try again.
So if it's like, not like you need to get through your homework, so you want to say like, you need to get through 5 minutes of homework?
Yes.
Okay.
You need to get through this page. You need to get through this thing. I know. Ain't nobody got time for this. I know. But like at the same time, it is the thing that gets them back on the right track. Sometimes it does take that level of like hand holding to get them back on the right track, because then otherwise we start going downhill with the self-esteem again, and everybody's like, what else? Screw this. I'm done for like 3 hours or 3 days or whatever. Anything else? Is it right now? Okay.
So this is just an example of what a chart might look like for an older child. So we had the very simple one for a younger child, but this would be, the behavior you're looking at, what specifically that means, how many points they get for that behavior, and then you could have different point levels at the bottom that they work towards. So with a child that's older, like this might be something that you can do on more of, say, a twice a week basis, rather than just in those very short intervals.
Can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
What you have as incentives here are in most cases normal life activities. Picking an activity to do, have a friend over, go to the movies. Those in most cases are normal life activities.
Right.
You're placing incentives on normal life activities. How do you distinguish between normal life activities and something you have to earn?
So that's a good question. So basically the way we're viewing it in this sense is that that is something that they are specifically working towards for that behavior. So you're being very specific with them in the sense of like, if you meet this goal, then, we can go to the movies this weekend or whatever it might be. So it's okay that you're still doing those day-to-day activities regularly, but they are still working towards something very specific. So I completely understand what you're saying about how that can be blurred at times.
No, it goes beyond blurring in my mind. Because if you have a plan to go to the movie with your family.
And you're not going to restrict that.
So why should I do this behavior if I'm going to go to the movie anyway?
So then you might want to look at a different incentive. If that's something that you already do on a pretty regular basis, if there's something that would be more specialized for that child then. Because it does depend a lot on the child as well.
You go to the negative approach and then saying, well, I guess we're not going to the movie if you're not doing it.
No.
Why not?
Because you're looking at whatever reward you're using for that particular behavior. So if the movie is just something that you're doing anyways, you would not want to use that as the incentive for the specific behavior that they're working on.
It could be used as a disincentive.
Go ahead.
Yes,
I
but
know your focus is positivity.
correct.
But sometimes this world isn't always positive.
That's fair, but wouldn't we want the world to teach our kids that? Why would we have to be the bad guy all the time?
There's reality. There's a positive approach, and then there's reality. I believe we should all be positive so that our children could have as much self-esteem as possible.
Yeah.
But some of the best learning items that a child, a human, an adult can have is something that happens negatively, and you can learn from that.
So we do get into consequences in a couple slides here. So it's not all positive. I mean, obviously there's consequences for negative behavior.
Yep, okay.
All right, so we've gone over this one for time's sake, so you have time at the end if there's more questions or whatever, like probably gonna move through this one. We've gone over that. As far as consequences go, consequences should be short-term, realistic, they can be enforced. Follow through with do not take a child's phone away for like 2 full weeks, so like if they have to call for rides or something like that, like that's not gonna work for any of us. Using a pointing system, child's not complying, prompted positive behavior, remind them like you did not earn your points or star at this time. As Holly said earlier, we can try again later. If the child is refusing an instruction or prompt, you can give them the choice of refusing to comply or losing a privilege. Avoid unnecessary power struggles, and then everything is negotiable except for the agreed upon house rules. So as far as like the overall consequences go, that's kind of like just our, basic guidelines. Everything can be much more specific with time, with like thought, with process, things like that. These are just generalized terms. So as far as the timeout goes, the purpose of a timeout would be for younger kiddos to decrease or eliminate an aggressive behavior. It must be, it must be initiated immediately following the aggressive behavior, or find a boring place, designate a space for timeout. Don't use their room because we don't want them to associate this with a punishment. Discuss the concept of timeout with the child before beginning to implement.
So in the same sense, when you're working on timeout, if a child is refusing to go to timeout, because obviously we know that that happens too, where they'll say, I don't want to go, or they're kick and scream, or whatever it might be, right? So you can also give them the choice in that matter. Either you go to timeout for your designated 5 minutes, whatever it might be, or you lose a privilege. And then you would be telling them specifically what that privilege is as well. Bless you. If they're resisting at first, so same thing, you can give them the choice. You also want to tailor timeouts to the age of the child, and not only the age, but what they're capable of and what level they're at as well. So it might be, say, a 5-minute timeout for a 6-year-old child, again, going back to time intervals and how those are important. Because although it sounds weird with timeout, you actually do want kids to be able to be successful with timeout as well. So if you try to put a 5-year-old in timeout for 15 minutes, we can't expect them to be able to comply with that, depending on their level. And you want to be specific with them when you're giving them a timeout. You have a 5-minute timeout for hitting or whatever it might be, so that they know exactly what that consequence is for.
Right. So as far as that goes, those were kind of like the basically consequences. Any questions, things like that? Go ahead.
I have a question about timeout. What do you do for a kid who just doesn't care? Great timeout, I'll say timeout, but it doesn't.
That would be the motivating factors thing, because obviously sitting alone by themselves is not the thing that is conducive to whatever's bothering them, right? That they don't care about that. So independent rewards may be their motivating factor. So they're doing something for the sole purpose of being able to sit alone. So you need to look at your motivating factors and figure out what that is, and if a motivating factor is not conducive to that consequence, then we need to look at changing the consequence so that it fits. Go ahead.
So you mentioned timeout as a possible consequence, but do you have other ones that have worked well for kids with impulse issues?
Like what?
So, just overall, if timeout, like she said, if that's, for example, my son will go start out in timeout, but like you said, loses interest in timeout, but doesn't have that capacity to not walk away or something like that. So I'm just wondering if there's other, I guess successful consequences that have actually changed behavior.
The consequences are always dependent upon what is motivating the kiddo. So for example, if a kiddo is, say, adult approval oriented and they're not following directions, then you would then immediately say well, we need a break until you're handling the situation better, or you feel like you can use calm body again, then we'll talk.
Does that website, when you click on the behavior, have possible consequences?
Oh yes, yes, there's definitely.
Intuitive in parenting.
Correct.
Which consequence would it effectively
It definitely does. It starts with the behavior, so you look at the behavior and then you go through like the tiers or things like that, and there's all kinds of like behavior interventions and things like that after the fact, but it really depends on what the kiddo is trying to get or want in the first place. Go ahead.
We went through a triple P, that positive parenting program, and they actually suggested in something like that, putting a toy in timeout instead of my daughter, or like she loves
Yes,
chocolate milk.
exactly. So, yes.
Chocolate milk is in timeout, and she was devastated. And
Yes.
I didn't have to force her to go do anything. It was like, I can control your chocolate milk.
Correct. That's what I mean when I say it's like the motivating factor. So if that's the thing that the kid wants, then that would be the thing that, yes, would have to be removed. Go ahead. Yeah.
This might sound awful, but what if it's a behavior that is very stressful and maybe even irritating, and you're pretty sure they're doing it on purpose, but you're not positive, like repetition of a particular statement, especially when they're getting 12 years old and
Yeah.
I'm sure they know how to press your buttons.
Yes.
It's a little murky to know how to address it and not personalize it.
Correct.
Give them to tools to know nobody's going to like it if you talk about the same thing 50 times.
So part of that is on the next slide, but if we're looking
Yeah.
at that from the concept of behavioralism, we want to be reinforcing positive behavior and we want to be ignoring negative behavior, unless it's aggressive or unsafe. So when kids are doing, say, more of those annoying behaviors, whether it be whining or repetition, and you can tell, like you said, that they're trying to strike a nerve because that's what they know, that evokes that reaction. Although very, very difficult, ignoring that behavior is typically what sends the child that message that they're not getting a reaction, you're not reinforcing it in any way. Because
Correct.
the reaction itself is reinforcement of that behavior.
Correct. Yeah.
So, I know that's not ideal because it's very difficult to ignore the annoying behavior.
Well,
but
it's interesting that it's sort of it's a subtle thing to tease out how to respond to.
Yes.
So maybe the approach of response that follows not a response is better.
Yeah. So speaking of ignoring negative behaviors, things like that. So this kind of goes back to the whole house rule thing, like negotiable, like don't sweat the small stuff. It might be best to ignore minor behavior problems until you have major problems controlled. So said another way, pick your battles. Define the behavior you want to decrease, only ignoring the annoying behaviors, not the aggressive behaviors. Aggressive behaviors fall under the house rule kind of category. Those would have to have an immediate consequence, okay? This says response. I think we all know we mean consequence in terms of like, yeah, that's not allowed. Deciding what type of ignoring to use. So this one is key. This one is also very much involved in what motivates your kiddo. So looking at like, is it that you can look away? Will that be enough to get them to be like, oh? Or will it be like talking to someone else, looking at a book, walking away, going and doing something else, things like that. Then also deciding when to ignore. So obviously annoying but non-safety issue behavior should be immediately ignored. Prompt once for positive behavior, then ignore the ignoring behavior if it continues. For example, if someone's whining, but they stop to ask you if you can stop at Dairy Queen, and you say to them, oh, well, thank you for not whining, but no, we're not going to Dairy Queen. And if they go back to whining, then you go back to ignoring. Do you see what I'm saying? But it has to switch like immediately. So if they stop the behavior, you immediately are like, thank you, for the attending. Yes, as she said. Is that next one mine?
Okay, so we'll go through this one somewhat quickly. So this is just about shaping behavior. So a lot of that is what we're talking about today. So we want to reinforce small steps. That's what they mean by successive approximations of the behavior. So we can't always expect the child to be able to do this new replacement behavior without reinforcing them along the way, without breaking it down into steps for them. So if a behavior is inconsistent or they don't really have it down at all yet, you definitely want to start with a step so that they can succeed that step and then move up from there to a more challenging step. So giving examples, say when you're looking at like the homework example that you mentioned, you might start with, praising them after they do one page of their homework, or work on this for 15 minutes and then you get a break, or whatever it might be. If you're looking at routine, like bedtime routine, you might start with, you're reinforcing them just brushing their teeth when they're asked. And then once they have that down, you're moving to a bigger part of the routine. So basically shaping behavior, breaking it down into smaller steps and reinforcing those along the way. You want to reinforce the behavior you're starting with until it occurs consistently for at least a few days before moving on to a different one, to make sure that they do have that established, they're in that routine, they're practicing that at least pretty consistently. And then slowly increasing the requirement for them to get the reinforcers. So, making it a little bit more challenging for them since they've gotten to the point where it's become easier. And then once the goal is actually reached, you still want to reinforce that behavior. So you still might praise them from time to time if you notice them doing that, or it still might be included in the behavior system that you're using. So we don't want to suddenly start ignoring it or dismissing it just because they're doing well at it.
Okay. So this next one is about modeling. This is also critical in terms of how we interact with our kiddos. So children learn through example. You have to walk the walk. You have to model positive behaviors, appropriate communication, problem-solving skills, coping skills, anger management, emotion regulation. We need to do our best to show them how it's handled appropriately so that they may not overreact or things like that when stuff starts going wrong for them. This is by far probably the most challenging of all of these things, because I know that, you lose it. Everybody gets frustrated, everybody gets angry, but it's important to allow your children to see that you were frustrated and see you emote, but see you emote appropriately and say, I was angry or I am angry, using I statements, things like that, so that they have a better idea of what it actually looks like when somebody gets mad or frustrated or things like that, so that they have a better idea or a better chance to mimic those things, because most of the time they really do just mimic what they see others doing. So that's why modeling is simultaneously the most important, but also probably the most difficult. So the next part of that would be if modeling appropriate behavior becomes impossible, meaning we lost it and started screaming at someone in the car, then modeling appropriate damage control. So apologizing when needed, remove yourself from the situation when needed, ask for help. I call this tag teaming it, so tag out. If you're close, you're not gonna make it, try to tag out with your partner. Hopefully use respite care if you don't have that option for you. Work to manage your emotions and make changes instead of just apologizing without then changing your behaviors, because this is the second really important part. It doesn't do me any good to apologize to my daughter if I do the next thing, do the same thing again the next day and the next day and the next day. So if I'm angry in the morning because she's running late and I snap at her every single morning by XYZ time, she doesn't care if I apologize to her on the way to school. She's like, well, it doesn't matter. It becomes useless at that point. So changing behavior is just as important as the actual act of taking responsibility for your actions. Doesn't matter. Okay, so quality time goes along with the motivation survey in terms of this would be an excellent thing to use as a motivator for kiddos when behaviors are out of control. So setting aside quality time, they value imaginative play, parents engaging in them with this is a very positive bonding experience. There's also quality time that should be separated and set aside to discuss behaviors, renew incentives chart, etc., but it should be separate, right? You don't go to the movies and discuss the next behavior thing. You have to go to the movies and then set a time to discuss it separately. So as far as that goes, we managed to get through the majority and still have 15-ish or more minutes left for questions and things. So before I start taking questions, these are some of the websites that we used that I would refer people to, specifically the PBISworld.com website. So just so you guys know, these links should work, unlike the other one, in terms of your getting the presentation, right? Okay, so
a lot of them are very educational
yes.
as well. So the Attitude magazine one, it does focus a lot on ADHD, but it has a lot of research, articles, things like that as well about different strategies you can use. And Lives in the Balance is helpful for parents as well. It'll give you links to resources. So it even has links on there for say parenting Facebook groups, for example. So supports as well.
Yep. Okay, so now we'll start with questions. Go ahead.
So I think a lot of us have a lot of like really individual questions.
Yes.
Of like, okay, this is my kid, and I know
Yes.
it's hard to answer those like when you don't see us. So especially of us that don't live in town, if we are looking for a therapist to work with individually, what would you suggest us looking for? Are there any key terms, key words?
Yes.
Or like what would we stay away from? Or even at the point where we don't feel like it's working, when do we move on to another therapist? And
Yeah.
what should we look for when we're trying to find someone to work with?
Sure.
If we're not.
So the first part of that I would answer by saying I would highly recommend using Psychology Today to search therapists in your area. Now, once you've searched therapists in your area, you need to be looking for things like see if they have parent management training, see if they have experience in working with kiddos with special needs, ask if they use CBT, which stands for cognitive behavioral therapy, ask if they have any background in behavioralism. Things like that, if they do like family therapy or anything like that. Those are all kind of like hot like words I would look for. Is there any other ones?
I'm just thinking credential-wise, it varies from state to state as well.
Yes.
But if you see like MFT, marriage and family therapists, a lot of the times they have a lot of experience in working with kids, family behaviors. And then if you're looking at like counselors, like if we're credentialed, you would probably want to be looking at their background and experience.
Right. You could also look for things like internal family systems, IFS, stuff like that. If you're looking for actual family therapy, that's a good alternative. What was the second part of your question?
Like, how do you know when to move on? Because I think, we do get frustrated and like, I mean, right now I'm working with like 3 different behavioral things, just like trying to like tag team. And so like, when do you realize, okay, maybe this isn't a good fit for our family, and how do you like find someone? I mean, I know how to find someone else, but like what do you do for that?
Well, honestly, the way I operate in therapy is that I firmly believe at least 50% of therapy is whether or not you can like come in, sit down and relate to your therapist on some level. I am not like the kind of therapist that like just because you came to an intake like you're stuck with me, right? Like I give clients at the end of the session like time to like think about like, do you want to reschedule? How are you feeling? Like the fit is, things like that. So those are things that I would really look for in the beginning, the very early stages of like finding a therapist, because like you do have to feel like you relate to them on some level. Some people don't want to see a therapist that doesn't have kiddos of their own. Okay, that's fine. But like if that's the case, then that's something you need to be looking for, stuff like that. As far as like that goes, I mean, if you're looking for that earlier on, I would say that you're probably going to know earlier on if it's a good fit. I personally do not like keeping clients more than like 18 months to 2 years at a time, because I feel like at that point, then maybe they do need a different experience or a different modality or a different like dynamic, like therapeutic relationship.
And I would say if you do have specific concerns too, or things that you don't feel like are going well, if you feel like you can bring it up to that therapist, like that's always very constructive, because then you might be able to gauge, like are they able to use a different approach? Are they able to hear the concerns you're giving? Or, then do you feel like you need to go elsewhere?
And if you feel like you are not comfortable enough to bring up concerns to your therapist, that is like, that's a red flag. Yeah. You might want to find a different therapist after that.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
How different or similar is, your program compared to like hiring an ABA therapist? Or, because I know, like you said, a lot of our kids fall into autism-like behaviors post-op. They're not labeled autistic, but so that's been like something that's been recommended to us. So
I definitely have used ABA before. I am not ABA certified, but because of my background in education, I am very familiar with ABA. ABA is incredibly condensed. We're talking like 30-second intervals for a reward. Like forget 5 minutes of homework. Like we're talking like 30 seconds, sit in your chair. So ABA is like very condensed. The only difference between, I feel, between true ABA and like an actual like LPCC-S or like, like therapist or psychologist is that are you looking at the family as a whole, or are you literally just like wanting this behavior to stop? Excuse me, because a lot of times ABA isn't going to address any of the other global issues within the family system. And I know from experience that anytime you have a kiddo with special needs, it impacts the entire family. So you really truly need to look at all of these additional concerns, considerations, whatever. So sometimes, a more traditional therapist would be beneficial for overarching things, whereas like if it's something that's just like really bad, like we have to stop doing this, then maybe an ABA specialist would be better for that.
And ABA is very behavioralistic. So like
Yes.
a lot of the things we talked about today with managing behavior would be kind of seen through the same lens. Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so hopefully, I think that a lot of these new techniques will help as building blocks and hopefully negate some of the problems that we're experiencing. But when it gets to the rage aspect,
Yes.
where it's violent and it's so out of control they're going to hurt themselves or hurt us, I find myself just having to restrict and play defense for a while, and then I'm using calming words and I'm trying to help them come back to a decent place.
If your child is at risk of hurting themselves, like severely hurting themselves or another person, then I would recommend you looking into to a form of, say, like strength training, things like that, so that you can prevent that child from going so far off that like they genuinely hurt themselves or another person.
So I feel like I have that part down.
Oh, the training you mean, or like
the defense? Like,
oh, okay.
I'm pre-equipped to not get. I can restrict them, and I can do it in a way that I feel like is a balance between not having them feel overwhelmed
Okay.
and still playing defense. Is there anything else?
Placing them. Honestly.
Sorry?
Without even thinking.
Oh,
the
yeah.
next step of
Yeah.
placing
Okay. I thought that's what you said, so I was just like trying to make sure.
Which is a hard.
I would have to think about that for a little bit, because that's a little bit more.
So I'm on the right track, though?
You definitely are on the right track. I mean, getting trained in that kind of stuff, if they're a true harm to themselves or another person or an animal or whatever, is like, yeah, definitely something to consider.
Yeah, it's just in the moment. It's not like they're intentional. Like they're not. It's not preconceived. It's just.
Well, if it's not preconceived, but is there, you could potentially still look though for triggers. And then prevent triggers, so that's something else. Yeah, that's something else to look at. Okay, I got a bunch of hands, I don't know I'm just gonna go in order, so go ahead.
To answer that question, I'm a therapist and I know this isn't a very popular solution.
Yes.
But honestly, when it's necessary, medication.
Yeah.
Medication is, I know it's overused and I know it's overprescribed.
Mhm.
When it's necessary, it's really effective.
At times, yes, I would agree with that.
Has weak rage, aggression, biting, scratching, pinching. We've done ABA for 5 years. We finally went to a psychiatrist and we're trying medication. We still do ABA, we still look for triggers. Just being honest, medication has helped. You're still going to hear her screaming. If anyone sees me walking down the hall, she's still screaming, tries to hit me with her crutch, but medication has helped so much. Less bite marks, less scratching, less pinching. We're talking rage. We're talking, it's horrible. I was like desperate, feeling depressed, horrible. Our whole family's affected. So I finally, after 5 years, was like, I gotta try medication. I know it's not popular, I agree. I'm not trying to say you don't do this stuff, but I just.
No, I agree. I agree with her, yes.
I can't keep living like this, so that's just what I did. Just being honest.
Okay, go ahead.
One thing that I wanted to add a perspective to is if you do look for therapy, if you find someone that's trauma-informed,
Yes.
that's been very helpful in our case. Sometimes my child's deficits are so beyond positive reinforcement that I found that having someone that really understands trauma, in effect of like emotional trauma, has been very helpful. I've used the trauma-informed parenting coach just online, and that helps me more than anything.
To follow up with that, so things, another modality that could be highly effective if you're looking for something that's more like trauma focused and you need that kind of like change without like trying to go through like the steps of positive behavior stuff. EMDR is incredibly useful to help with treating trauma, treating like negative core beliefs, things like that, to help correct some of that, and it definitely can be used for kiddos. But because it's called EMDR. But the problem with that is that you would need to use, like, say, it wouldn't be a traditional EMDR because we're talking kiddos that have epilepsy here. Bilateral stimulation is cross-body stimulation that is not recommended, but they have alternatives to traditional EMDR. They're called buzzies generally, or like a lot of different things. Just handheld things that kind of buzz like alternately, things like that. Doesn't require eye movement, but it still does the same thing. In the back. Yeah, so tapping.
Kids can learn to just say like positive statements and tap,
Yep.
and it has the same effect. But I just want to add some of these strategies I've been using with my daughter. She had significant aggression behaviors when we weren't able to leave the house. She couldn't be near another kid because she was so aggressive. Poke their eyes out, bleeding, she would cause bruising and bleeding on her therapist. I mean, really bad. And we did these techniques. It's been 4 years, and a combination of doing that consistently. Like, it takes a lot.
Yes, it takes forever, yeah.
And it took 2 years before we can even get the aggression to decrease at all. But now, I mean, she went 60 days with no aggression at school. She went an entire school year without any aggressive behavior.
Yeah, that's amazing.
I haven't seen aggression at home in probably 30 days.
Yeah.
Like, it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of repetition.
You have to be consistent and persistent.
Huge.
Yep.
But it just takes a lot of time. Her kids may not learn it. She takes a lot of
Just
time.
tapping.
And then the other thing is, we learned that she had undiagnosed hydrocephalus that didn't present typically. And when she had surgery to correct that, a lot of the aggression went down. Like, it finally kicked it into gear, and we were able to get that last
Good.
bit.
Glad to hear.
But it was not a typical presentation, so the doctors didn't notice. And it didn't she didn't show changes on her MRI, so they didn't imagine it, they didn't see it.
Okay.
So we finally treated that, and the rest of the aggression kicked down.
Good.
She's 8.
Go ahead.
Is there a specific program for TBI, traumatic brain injury, a specific counseling and behavior program for that? Because that's really what our kids have.
Correct. No, there's not. Not to my knowledge. It's eclectic. I would highly encourage you to look for someone that has a background in working with kiddos with special needs. It has to be like eclectic, and it's pretty intensive.
Somebody with a TBI, because I didn't hear that phrase before surgery. I found it afterwards. And that led me down a different research path.
Yeah.
Addressing my daughter's behaviors when I acknowledged it wasn't that TBI.
Yeah, unfortunately, no, there's nothing like conducive exactly to TBI. There's lots of other things that are designed for other, psychological issues, but not TBI. TBI takes an eclectic approach with the appropriate background and the appropriate fit. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to kind of state what she was saying, finding other things. One of the things we found is we moved around because we're a military family, and so it's going through universities. And I know not everybody lives here in university, but like Holly now has been doing, she did the University of Hawaii for a while, and now we are in Florida, and she's part of Florida Institute of Technology's School of Autism. So we take her in the spring and in the fall.
Cool.
And there's social development classes.
Yep, social skills are good.
She's very socially inappropriate, and and I mean, and it's like, everybody else is saying, with our kids, it takes years. I mean, we've been working with her since she's been 2 with therapies to try and get rid of and correct things. But anyway, if you've got a university, reach out to that university and see what programs they offer, because like in Florida or even in Hawaii, it's run by a PhD, the department, but then they have PhD candidates and master's level people who are working with the kids and doing all this stuff, and so.
So real quick too, we'll get to you 1 second, but just to kind of wrap things up is if anybody does have additional questions, need resources, anything like that, we have a table out there. We'll be at lunch too.
Yes.
They did ask us to have people fill out surveys in the back if you're open to doing that. But go ahead with your question, just in case people need to leave.
I was just going to operate some to 6. I just received therapy this spring from I can't say enough about what's helped family dynamics and how we can break up behavioral issues that are just go in and stop fighting.
Yep.
They can be very, very helpful as a treatment modality. I mean, sometimes we don't even think of it that way.